Welcome to Energy Talks, the podcast for energy nerds and folks who enjoy interesting conversation. I'm journalist Markham Hislop, and today's guest is Professor Mark Winfield of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. I've had him on many times, and he has written an article in the conversation called Why the Federal Government Must Act Cautiously on Fast-Tracking Project Approvals. So welcome back to Energy Talks, Mark.
Hi, Markham. How are you doing?
Good, good. Hey, look, so this your piece came out today, the day after the first ministers met in Saskatoon yesterday, and their meeting was all about this, right? I mean, it was Mark Carney's build, build, build. We're going to build big projects, build infrastructure, all of that kind of stuff, and that is really the context for your article.
It is. I mean, this began to emerge during the election debate as we suddenly discovered impact assessment in the debate. But this seems to be where the focus has settled, or one of the two things around which the focus is, seems to be settling around this question of how to respond to Trump and where do we go from here, and this notion that there are barriers around projects that would free us from Mr. Trump seems to have taken hold quite deeply.
Now, you've got four or five issues that you dealt with in your article and want to get to those. But I want to start with one that's near and dear to my heart, which is there a business case for a pipeline to the West Coast? And the discussion I've had with pipeline advocates online is always, well, look at Trans Mountain expansion. Look at what a benefit it's been to the industry and so on. So I went and looked at the modeling, and the assumptions are the modeling is full of holes. Okay. So then I went back and I said, proponents, boosters, uh, are there customers in Asia, which is essentially we're talking China and India. And they gave me a bunch of gobbledygook that meant nothing. So I spent literally 2 weeks doing work, tracking down what a business case might look like. And here's what I found, just to give you an example. So the competitors in India and China are usually Middle Eastern heavy crudes like Basra heavy and Arab heavy from Saudi Arabia, that kind of stuff. And you might get $60 or $62 a barrel in China. The problem is that in Canada, it costs you $18 to get to that market because Trans Mountain expansion is 11 or $12, and put it on a tanker and it costs you another $5, $6, and there's dockage fees and insurance and so on. So if Basra is getting $60 from a Chinese refiner, you essentially have to offer that Canadian crude at $42. Well, the problem is if you sold it in Houston, you get $48. So you're losing $6 by my calculation. And I admit I am not an oil trader and I'm tracking down sources so I can confirm all of this. But we're hurtling towards this pipeline, one or two pipelines apparently, that might be built. And we don't even ask these basic questions about do we have customers for this stuff?
No, I think this is one of the fundamental questions about all of these projects which are being floated. Is there an economic rationale? And as been pointed out by a number of people, the absence of private sector proponents for much of this is somewhat telling in terms of their assessment of the market and the risk. Um, so, I mean, indeed, our former Minister of the Environment was pointing out that TMX itself is actually underutilized, which would make the case for an additional pipeline through BC or to the Pacific coast shakier still. To say nothing of the fact that the government of BC was making it very clear through all of this that it's less than enthusiastic about the idea, and that could complicate things enormously as well.
Now, pipelines are something that I report on a lot. So that's where I go to when we talk about this stuff. But you make the point that fast tracking can bypass thorough environmental assessments And the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was putting Northern Gateway back on the table. And so this was, Canadians will remember that it was a 525,000 barrel a day pipeline. It was going to go from Edmonton basically to Kitimat on the northwest BC coast. And it got canned because the company did such a poor job consulting with Indigenous communities that, it would have been mired in courts for forever.
Well, the federal court rejected the approvals
Yeah,
because they had failed to fulfill the duty to consult.
exactly. So here's my point. Danielle Smith has put this back on the table, and she now wants it to go to Prince Rupert. Well, Professor Andrew Leach, who's an energy economist at the University of Alberta, you know him, and he went on Twitter and he screenshot a page from the Enbridge's own environmental assessment, and they said, "Look, we looked at the route to Prince Rupert, but it's all through mountainous terrain."
Hmm.
And you just can't do it safely and economically when you go through. So the environmental assessment on that route has already been done, and it shouldn't be done. It's too dangerous and too expensive. And I just have this funny feeling that little details like that under a fast track process will probably just be swept under the rug.
Well, the track record is not good of fast tracking and bypassing. And of course, there are other very prominent examples of that. C and BC comes up a lot. Muskrat Falls and Newfoundland and Labrador had a public inquiry that basically said, to say nothing of the fact the assessment panel had already said this thing isn't economic. So there is a record here of short circuiting the process not ending well because it means questions that should be asked don't get asked and assumptions don't get challenged. And then you end up with what can be uh, politely described as, at best, white elephants. At worst, things that pose very significant environmental safety risks.
The other thing you talked about, or another thing you talked about, was Indigenous rights. And for our American audience, and maybe some Canadians who don't realize this, under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, on projects, large, projects that go through traditional territories or treaty areas, it is a constitutional requirement that those communities be consulted. Now, what consultation means is a little fuzzy and open to interpretation, but the Supreme Court has weighed in on this, and there are criteria to judge them by. And yeah, it's not something you can do overnight, right? It's an arduous, listening to people and talking to people takes a little while, as Enbridge found out with Northern Gateway. And this might be the stickiest wicket of all for fast tracking any project.
Well, it may well be. I mean, the courts have actually been very clear that consultation needs to be meaningful and substantive. And indeed, that is precisely what Northern Gateway and TMX on the first round were rejected on the basis of. So you can't fast track that. And indeed, um, trying to do so, and this is something the chiefs of Ontario were emphasizing over Ontario's Bill 5, which is its own story, but essentially is another attempt to fast track approvals. We're emphasizing that indeed you push too hard, what you're going to get is resistance on the land, blockades and protests and other things. And indeed, we know this because last time we went through this on the Ring of Fire, Doug Ford said he was going to jump on the bulldozer and build his own road. And that really set the process back 5 years because the Indigenous communities in the affected area in Ontario were basically felt so offended and disrespected that they just didn't want to engage at all. So this is not stuff you can rush. Indigenous communities, as you say, hold structural legal power in these conversations that no federal or provincial legislation can bypass. And that changes the landscape for these conversations in fairly fundamental ways.
Yeah, and we should point out again for the American audience, there is no equivalent requirement under the American Constitution or even under American legislation, like federal legislation. And so this is unique to Canada. And there was a study that came out in 2018 from the Canadian Energy Research Institute, which has since gone, is now defunct. But it said that, roughly the time it took to approve a pipeline in the United States and Canada was roughly the same. The difference was 19 months, which was required for Aboriginal consultation. So if you assume that, given the track record of inadequate consultation, maybe it might take 2 years, maybe it might take 30 months. You know, Prime Minister Carney's promise of fast tracking to 2 years seems optimistic.
Well, particularly when the government is also making references to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and making commitments about free, prior, informed consent. These are not conversations that can be rushed. And again, the attempts at rushing them have a tendency to backfire badly and actually introduce more delay. So I think this is part of the caution here is that the track record more broadly of trying to force approvals through is not good. It tends to prompt backlashes, and that introduces more delay than ever. It's also important to keep in mind with the Indigenous communities. I mean, again, there is no guarantee of consent. I mean, the courts have been very clear about this, that this is not a checklist process. This is a fact and situation specific in terms of what the courts will ultimately regard as adequate consultation in the particular circumstance of a particular project.
And it should be pointed out that because the project proponents say, well, look, we've got all these, First Nations that are on board and these organizations that are on board. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen Indigenous leaders say, we don't speak as one voice.
Yeah.
There's a lot of diversity and differing opinions, and the Wet'suwet'en for the Coastal GasLink protests is a good example because the hereditary chief says no, and they had a camp, and there was RCMP raided it a number of times, but the elected council said yes. How do you resolve that? And it took months and months and months of sometimes violent behavior or action on the part of the RCMP, and it slowed things down. And I don't know how you wave a wand in Ottawa and fast track that.
Well, indeed, you can't, and indeed, we've seen the same thing over the Ring of Fire, where there have been some communities prepared to engage and others less so. But then the Ford government's attempt to basically pursue a divide and conquer strategy, which again it's trying around Bill 5, just reinforced the conflict both with Indigenous communities but among communities as well. And again, was to put it mildly, unproductive in terms of moving these conversations forward. Indigenous communities know when they're being trying to be played against each other, and that does not go down well.
Let's talk about public participation because this is, again, with respect to pipelines, is deeply, deeply troubling to me because on March 19th, 14 oil and gas CEOs sent a letter to the leaders of the Canadian political parties. We were just in an election at that time. And one of the things that they asked for, which I found I was appalled, to be honest, is they said that the federal government use all available emergency powers, which there's no construction you can put around that that doesn't mean the Emergency Act, the War Measures Act, and is essentially it gives the federal government the right to oppress, suppress Canadians' rights and freedoms. And they insisted that that power be used to push pipeline projects through. And for why? For one reason only, to allow our industry to reach its full potential. And I'm quoting almost verbatim. I find that objectionable. There is no amount of fast tracking anything. I don't care what it is, pipeline, port, bridge, you name it, where you give the federal government the power to suppress Canadians' rights in order to make that project go faster. I find that very objectionable.
Well, indeed, and indeed legally it could be very doubtful in terms of whether, I mean, this is effectively what Mr. Trump is trying to do and what the US Federal Trade Court just said. There is no emergency. And indeed, it's not clear whether the necessary authorities existed under the legislation under which Mr. Trump was trying to act anyway. Um, we just went through an inquiry around the Emergencies Act, how that would interact with the conversation we are just having in terms of Indigenous rights, to say nothing of the Charter. Um, I don't know, but I agree, it's quite shocking. I mean, to some degree, like the question's been raised in relation to the Ring of Fire. Is this what we've come to? Like this sort of quasi, what they're essentially evoking is a kind of quasi authoritarian kind of invocation of state power, um which I don't think has been part of our culture, and I don't think we're as frightened by Mr. Trump to need to lower ourselves to that kind of a level. And it doesn't obviate the problem that there may not be any economic rationale for these projects. um we still need to ask these kinds of questions, because otherwise it's the taxpayers of Canada, among other things, who also end up carrying the liabilities in relation to them, as we're seeing with TMX now. I mean, there's lots of conversations to the effect that there's no way the taxpayers ever going to get their money back on that project.
Yeah, Professor Trevor Tome, who's an economist at the University of Calgary, wrote a much quoted article addressing that issue, and he said it doesn't matter. He said because one day, we'll sell it and we'll make all the money back on the sale. Well, that's great if your assumption is that a sale is possible, and if you can't find a buyer, then it's not possible. And but I want to talk about health implications. And again, I don't know what they would be in other infrastructure, but pipelines and the oil industry I do know some about, and not so much on the pipelines, though I suppose they would, there would be some health implications. It's upstream. If because the pipelines would only be shipping diluted bitumen, and bitumen comes from the Alberta oil sands, and we have had numerous cases in the last 2, 3 years. The Imperial Oil's Curl project has got two or three leaks, one really serious one, and there have been some others. And and the Indigenous communities up in northern Alberta are complaining all the time that they feel their health effects, like higher cancer rates and so on. So if you have to expand the oil sands in order to fill up another pipeline or two pipelines, because they were talking about another one up to Churchill, Manitoba, then it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. If it's in northern Alberta, we're not going to worry about that. We're not going to, are we going to study that? Are we going to discuss the health implications? Probably not. And I'm concerned about that.
Well, we've been discussing health implications for a good few decades now and have done very little about it. But yes, the implication here is that the only rationale is to expand oil sands production, with all of the consequences that go with that in terms of greenhouse gases and other impacts. And indeed, we know the Alberta Energy Regulator hung a figure of $270 billion on the accumulated liabilities, which of course is an estimate because some of those tailings, nobody actually knows how to clean up. That's sort of a guesstimate. So yeah, there's a whole raft of downstream consequences. The same thing again could be said in relation to the Ring of Fire, which sits in the middle of the boreal region, in northern Ontario, which is of course a global scale carbon sequestration and storage site. Um, so these are all questions that sort of need to be thought through, and don't seem to be there. And the question also would arise, given that oil sands is relatively expensive oil, um, is there really going to be a market? If you were to spend billions of public dollars, which is what this looks more and more like given the TMX model, um, is there really going to be a market there? And I think that that question is very, very much out there in this whole conversation.
I interviewed Dr. Andrei Sobolewski a few years ago, and he had worked in the oil sands for years and years. He's an environmental ecologist, and he works now in mines all over the world. He specializes in tailings ponds. And of course, there's massive, massive tailing ponds. I think it's 1.7 trillion liters or something in them up in northern Alberta. He said, Markham, there's 9,000 square kilometers of disturbed, sensitive ecosystem up there. He said, there has never been in the history, nobody anywhere on this planet has ever tried to reclaim 9,000 square kilometers. We don't have the technology, we don't have the knowledge, we just don't know. And so it's not just about managing the tailings ponds or reclaiming the tailings ponds per se. There's all of the other areas that have been just, I mean, it's our gargantuan problem that we have been turning a blind eye to. And if we're now proposing that we would expand the oil sands in order to fill up these other pipelines, I don't know. I mean, it may turn out that we put environmental liabilities and environmental damage on the table for discussion. And if you're fast, and they probably should be, you fast track it, and there goes the discussion.
Well, these are questions that any credible impact assessment process would have to take into account. Is what are you going to do with the tailings? What's the nature of the long-term impacts? You're going to create more waste streams that are going to require perpetual care. This is all the kind of stuff that is potentially going to be swept under the rug. I mean, even under the existing process, getting at the upstream questions is going to be difficult, but from a larger sustainability and climate change perspective is essential. To say nothing of the implications for the downstream communities onto whom the pollution burden is ultimately going to fall and who are already subject to very, very extended exposures to a whole range of hazardous and toxic materials.
I think for like I don't know about many of the other types of infrastructure projects that are outside the energy industry that we might would fall under this process. But I know enough about the oil and gas industry and the pipeline industry to know that those alone represent serious, serious risk, both financial, political, legal, and health and environmental and so on. And the idea of somehow fast tracking and therefore, just winking at some of these serious issues, I know it sounds great to fast track something, and that's what industry wants. But I'm not sure that is. I think that we're headed down a dangerous road if we do that.
Well, there are many layers to this. I mean, one is we discussed is first of all the fast tracking can simply backfire, and indeed that tends to be the track record. But the other questions have to be, what are you skating over and not asking questions about because you haven't left yourself time to investigate things properly. What are you going to skate over? And there are these underlying questions of, well, do these projects make sense? I mean, at times it's like every bad idea from the last half century is back on the table. And there are reasons why these things haven't happened before because they didn't make any sense. But it becomes very important that you have this check on that process. I mean, what you don't want, and we're seeing this south of the border a lot, is that every idea that pops into politicians' heads gets translated or attempts to be translated into reality. Um, that's probably not a good way to run things. Indeed, in Ontario right now, we have the premier go on his wish list for Mr. Carney is his idea to bury the 401 highway through the middle of Toronto. Um, something on which the optimistic price tags are in the 60 billion range, and the more realistic ones get into triple digits. Um, that's exactly the sort of thing in a sense that you want some kind of check on to ask, is this a good idea? Before we commit enormous time and resources to something, and indeed open the door to a whole range of impacts which we may have not even contemplated yet.
Well, I have no doubt, Mark, that I'll be talking to you on a regular basis over the next few years as this process unfolds, because it seems like it has a quite a bit of political momentum, and it probably is unstoppable. Well, maybe not unstoppable, but it's certainly going to go. It'll proceed, and we'll see how it plays out. So, Mark, thank you very much. Always appreciate your insights.
No, very good to see you. Thank you.